Your translator just lied to you." The words were quiet, almost swallowed by the soft piano music drifting through the crystal-lit dining room, yet they landed with enough weight to freeze a billion-dollar negotiation in place. Every executive at the private table slowly turned toward the man who had spoken. 9 hours earlier, before polished boardrooms, tailored suits, and impossible decisions collided beneath crystal chandeliers, Nathan Brooks was standing in the small kitchen of a modest brick duplex on the quiet edge of Naperville, Illinois. The morning sunlight filtered through faded white curtains while the scent of cinnamon oatmeal drifted through the air. 8-year-old Lily Brooks sat at the worn oak table carefully coloring a picture of the Chicago skyline, stopping every few seconds to look up at her father with the same quiet smile that reminded him so much of her mother. "You are going to be late again," she teased with a grin. Nathan looked at the old wall clock and laughed softly. "You might be right." He packed her lunch with practiced hands, slipping a handwritten note between the apple slices and turkey sandwich just as he did every school day. Every note carried a different sentence. Every sentence carried the same promise. "You are never alone." Lily folded the note without reading it. "I already know what it says," she whispered. Nathan smiled. "That is because you know your father." Their old pickup truck rumbled to life after the second attempt, and they drove beneath towering maple trees painted in the deep greens of early summer. The radio played quietly while commuters hurried toward downtown Chicago. Nathan never complained about the long drive. It gave him 20 peaceful minutes with the most important person in his world. After dropping Lily at school with their familiar handshake and hug, he continued toward the historic luxury hotel where he had worked for nearly 4 years. Few employees knew much about him. They knew he always arrived 30 minutes early. They knew he never called in sick. They knew he treated every guest with the same calm respect whether they ordered coffee or reserved the presidential suite. Beyond that, Nathan remained something of a mystery. "Morning, Brooks," called Marcus, the restaurant manager. "Big night tonight. International executives. No mistakes." Nathan nodded. "There never are." Marcus chuckled. "That confidence is why everyone asks for your section." Nathan simply tied his apron and began polishing silverware until every fork reflected the warm glow of the dining room lights. He believed every small task deserved the same care because character revealed itself most clearly when nobody was watching. Throughout the afternoon, the restaurant slowly awakened. Linen tablecloths settled smoothly across polished tables. Crystal glasses caught ribbons of sunlight pouring through tall windows overlooking the Chicago River. The quiet hum of preparation blended with soft jazz drifting through hidden speakers. Guests arrived from every corner of the country and far beyond. Nathan welcomed each one with the same steady voice, remembering names, favorite drinks, dietary preferences, and anniversaries without writing anything down. It was a gift his coworkers often joked about. "You have the memory of a computer." One server laughed as Nathan delivered a complicated order without missing a single detail. Nathan only smiled. "People remember how you make them feel. The least I can do is remember their names." Near sunset, several black luxury sedans stopped outside the hotel entrance. Security personnel moved with discreet precision while hotel executives hurried across the marble lobby. Marcus approached Nathan with unusual seriousness. "Private dining room tonight. Highest priority guests we have hosted all year. A technology merger. International delegation. Confidential everything." Nathan acknowledged the assignment with a simple nod. As he prepared fresh coffee service for the reserved room, a man wearing an expensive navy suit walked past him while speaking rapidly into a wireless earpiece. The hotel coordinator whispered, "That is the translator hired for tonight. Apparently, he has handled negotiations all over Europe." Nathan glanced at him only briefly before returning to his work. Yet as the translator greeted the arriving delegation, one short exchange caught Nathan's attention. Two executives spoke quietly in a regional European dialect that few Americans would recognize. The translator answered with a polished smile, but one phrase sounded strangely forced. Nathan paused for less than a heartbeat before continuing to arrange the silver coffee service exactly as before. His expression never changed. Still, somewhere deep inside, an old instinct quietly awakened, the kind that noticed not only the words people spoke, but the truths they quietly chose to leave behind. The first guests entered the private dining room just after 7 o'clock, carrying with them the quiet confidence that came from leading global companies. Dark suits, understated watches, polished shoes, and measured conversations filled the room with an atmosphere where every smile concealed careful calculation. Nathan Brooks moved between the tables almost invisibly, refilling water glasses before anyone noticed they were half empty, replacing folded napkins with practiced precision, and making certain every course arrived at exactly the right temperature. Years of service had taught him that the finest hospitality often went unnoticed, and he preferred it that way. At the center of the room, Victoria Hale greeted the visiting executives with calm professionalism. She projected certainty without arrogance, offering firm handshakes and direct eye contact that immediately earned respect. Across from her sat the European delegation led by Matthias Keller, a silver-haired manufacturing executive whose reputation for cautious negotiations was known throughout the industry. Standing just behind him was the translator, confidently bridging every sentence between English and the visitor's native language. At first, everything appeared ordinary. Compliments about Chicago, remarks about the weather, friendly observations about American hospitality. Nathan poured fresh coffee while quietly listening to the rhythm of the conversation without appearing interested. Then the discussion shifted toward intellectual property, manufacturing rights, and long-term licensing agreements. The room became noticeably quieter. Every sentence now carried the weight of millions of dollars. Nathan happened to be placing fresh bread beside the delegation when Matthias spoke again. His tone remained warm, almost reassuring, but Nathan caught a subtle phrase that never reached Victoria's ears. The translator smiled politely before delivering a completely different version in English. Victoria nodded thoughtfully, unaware that one important condition had quietly disappeared from the translation. Nathan continued walking without changing expression. Perhaps he had misunderstood. He hoped he had. A few minutes later, another executive asked a detailed question regarding regional production authority. Matthias answered carefully, emphasizing cooperation and balanced responsibility between both companies. Once again, the translator spoke. Once again, the English version sounded stronger, harsher, and far more favorable to Victoria's company than the original statement had been. Nathan slowed for the briefest moment beside a service station. Two mistakes could happen. Experienced interpreters occasionally searched for better wording under pressure. But this did not sound like uncertainty. It sounded intentional. Soft jazz floated through hidden speakers while candlelight reflected across crystal glasses. Outside, passing boats left shimmering trails across the Chicago River. Inside, the warmth of roasted rosemary, fresh coffee, and polished cedar mixed with an almost invisible tension that only a handful of people seemed able to sense. Nathan glanced toward the translator again. The man maintained perfect posture, confident smiles, and effortless professionalism. Yet every time Matthias finished speaking, the translator hesitated for less than a second before choosing different words instead of equivalent ones. Those tiny pauses spoke louder than the translations themselves. Nathan remembered something his late wife had once told him. Truth rarely disappeared all at once. It usually vanished one carefully chosen word at a time. The attorneys seated beside Victoria remained satisfied because the translated terms appeared remarkably favorable. One board member even whispered, "This deal is turning out better than we expected." Victoria remained composed, but Nathan noticed she had begun asking fewer direct questions. She trusted the interpreter to carry every subtle meaning across the language barrier. That trust was becoming increasingly expensive. As dessert menus quietly appeared beside each place setting, Matthias spoke once more, this time switching naturally into Swiss German while addressing one of his colleagues. Most people around the table never noticed the change. The translator did. Nathan did as well. The translator answered in standard German before immediately turning back toward Victoria with another polished English explanation that barely resembled what had actually been said. Nathan felt a quiet certainty settle over him. This was no misunderstanding. Someone was deliberately steering two honest conversations toward two completely different destinations. And if nobody stopped it before the contracts were signed, both companies would leave the room believing they had agreed to the same future when in truth they had accepted two entirely different promises. Nathan stood beside the polished service station with a fresh pot of coffee warming his hands while the conversation continued as though nothing unusual had happened. His eyes moved from one speaker to another, not searching for mistakes anymore, but confirming a pattern that had become impossible to ignore. Matthias Keller spoke with remarkable precision, choosing every word carefully because decades in international manufacturing had taught him that trust often depended on a single sentence. Yet by the time those sentences reached Victoria Hale, they carried meanings he had never intended. Nathan felt a familiar conflict settle quietly inside him. It was not his meeting. It was not his responsibility. He was a waiter whose job was to refill glasses, clear plates, and remain invisible. Still, another voice echoed through his memory, one he had carried for years. His late wife had often smiled whenever he hesitated to help a stranger. Doing the right thing is rarely convenient, she would say. That is why it matters. Nathan took a slow breath. Around him, the private dining room glowed beneath elegant chandeliers. Candlelight reflected across crystal glasses, while silverware rested untouched beside carefully prepared desserts. The soft music, the polished wood, and the quiet professionalism of the staff created the illusion that everything was unfolding perfectly. Only Nathan could hear the invisible cracks forming beneath that polished surface. Victoria accepted another translated explanation and reached for the leather folder containing the final agreement. One of her attorneys slid a fountain pen toward her with an encouraging smile. "Everything appears to be in order," he said quietly. "We are ready." Across the table, Matthias nodded politely, believing they had reached a balanced understanding that protected both companies equally. Neither side realized they were preparing to sign two completely different interpretations of the same partnership. Nathan looked toward the translator once more. Their eyes met for barely a second. Confidence disappeared from the man's expression, replaced by something far less comfortable. It lasted only an instant before the practiced smile returned, but it was enough. Nathan knew. The translator knew that Nathan knew. The room seemed to grow strangely still. Even the gentle clink of silver against porcelain faded into the background. Nathan carefully set the coffee pot onto the sideboard and walked toward the table with the same calm pace he used when serving every guest. No hurried movements. No raised voice. No desire to embarrass anyone. Marcus, watching from the entrance, frowned in confusion as Nathan approached the executives. One attorney immediately looked irritated. "Excuse me," he said sharply. "We do not need service at the moment." Nathan stopped a respectful distance from Victoria. His hands remained folded in front of him. His voice was steady enough that everyone at the table heard every word without effort. "Ma'am, may I have 1 minute before you sign?" Several executives exchanged bewildered looks. Someone gave a short laugh. Another whispered, "What is happening?" Victoria slowly lifted her eyes. She had spent years recognizing panic, arrogance, ambition, and manipulation. None of those emotions appeared on Nathan's face. There was only quiet conviction. "This meeting is confidential," one attorney interrupted. "Return to your duties immediately." Nathan nodded politely without taking another step. "I understand, sir." Then he looked back at Victoria. "I also understand that 1 minute now may save years of litigation later." Silence settled over the room. Victoria studied him carefully. "Explain yourself." Nathan spoke without hesitation. "The agreement you believe you reached does not exist. Mr. Keller has consistently described a shared licensing partnership with regional limitations. The translations you received describe permanent exclusive manufacturing authority." The translator responded almost instantly. "That is completely inaccurate." Nathan turned toward Matthias and addressed him directly in fluent Swiss German. The elderly executive's eyebrows rose in visible surprise. Nathan calmly repeated the exact sentence Matthias had spoken moments earlier, word for word, preserving every nuance and every condition exactly as it had originally been expressed. Matthias slowly stood from his chair. He looked first at Nathan, then at Victoria, before answering in the same dialect. Nathan translated into English without hesitation. This time the meaning was entirely different from what the room had previously heard. Victoria felt the color drain from her certainty. She did not look at Nathan first. She looked at her translator, whose confident smile had quietly disappeared. Nobody spoke for several long seconds. The only sound inside the private dining room came from the quiet hum of the climate control system and the faint clink of melting ice against crystal glasses. Matthias Keller continued looking at Nathan with growing curiosity before replying once again in Swiss German, this time speaking more slowly, almost as though he wished to remove every possible doubt. Nathan listened without interrupting. When Matthias finished, Nathan repeated every sentence in clear English, preserving not only the meaning but also the careful tone behind each word. He explained that the European company had never intended to surrender exclusive manufacturing rights. Their proposal had always centered on equal cooperation, regional licensing, shared innovation, and long-term trust between both organizations. Victoria lowered her eyes to the contract in front of her. The translated notes beside the document described something entirely different. Her legal team quickly compared both versions, flipping through page after page while whispering to one another with growing concern. Across the table, the translator shifted his weight for the first time that evening. His polished confidence had begun to crack. One attorney cleared his throat. "Mr. Keller," he asked carefully, "would you mind confirming this interpretation yourself?" Matthias smiled politely before answering in English. His accent was noticeable, but clear. "The waiter is correct. That is exactly what I have been saying throughout this meeting." Every face around the table turned toward Nathan. The restaurant manager standing near the entrance looked completely stunned. Marcus had watched Nathan carry trays, polish silverware, and greet guests for years, yet he had never imagined the quiet waiter could navigate one of the rarest German dialects with such effortless precision. Victoria studied Nathan differently now. She no longer saw a hotel employee interrupting an executive meeting. She saw a man who had remained silent until silence itself threatened to become dangerous. "How did you learn Swiss German?" she asked quietly. Nathan hesitated for only a moment. "Many years ago," he answered. "I had reasons to learn more than one language." He offered nothing more. He did not mention certificates. He did not mention experience. He simply stepped back as though hoping the meeting could continue without him. Matthias gently raised one hand. "Please," he said with a warm smile. "Would you remain for another moment?" Nathan nodded respectfully. Matthias spoke again, this time switching naturally between Swiss German, French, and Italian, testing not with arrogance, but with genuine curiosity. Nathan answered each question in the same language in which it had been asked, never rushing, never searching for words. The conversation flowed naturally, carrying the ease of two people who understood not only vocabulary, but also culture, humor, and courtesy. Even the smallest expressions were translated with remarkable accuracy. One executive from Zurich quietly laughed after Nathan preserved an old regional saying that could not have been translated literally. "That expression has not been understood correctly outside Switzerland in years," the executive admitted with visible admiration. "Where exactly did you study?" Nathan smiled politely. "Life has been an excellent teacher." His answer revealed almost nothing, yet somehow explained everything about the humility in his voice. Victoria noticed another detail that impressed her even more than his languages. Nathan never attempted to embarrass the translator. He never boasted. He never sought recognition. Every time someone praised him, he redirected the conversation back toward the agreement itself, reminding everyone that the partnership mattered far more than his involvement. The atmosphere inside the room slowly transformed. What had begun as suspicion evolved into respect. The executives who had dismissed him only minutes earlier now listened with complete attention whenever he spoke. The expensive suit no longer commanded the room. Neither did the executive title. Character did. As Nathan quietly returned the untouched coffee pot to the center of the table, Victoria watched him with thoughtful eyes. She had spent decades identifying talent in boardrooms filled with graduates from the finest universities in the world. Yet somehow the most remarkable person she had encountered that evening had been serving coffee while everyone else had been busy overlooking him. And somewhere behind the uneasy silence of the translator, another secret was waiting patiently to be discovered. Nathan quietly stepped back from the table, expecting the conversation to continue without him, but Matthias Keller gently motioned for him to remain where he was. The older executive smiled with the kind of expression reserved for meeting someone unexpectedly familiar. "Mr. Brooks," he said in careful English, "forgive my curiosity, but have we met before?" Nathan shook his head politely. "I do not believe so, sir." Matthias studied him for another moment before switching effortlessly into French. Nathan answered in equally natural French. The room grew silent again. Matthias changed to Italian. Nathan replied without hesitation. Finally, the executive spoke a brief sentence in Dutch before smiling knowingly. Nathan answered once more with quiet confidence, never rushing, never showing off, simply communicating as naturally as though he were greeting old neighbors across a fence. One by one, the international guests exchanged astonished looks. Victoria noticed that none of them seemed surprised by Nathan's knowledge alone. They appeared impressed by something deeper. He understood regional expressions, cultural etiquette, and subtle humor that could never be memorized from textbooks. Extraordinary, whispered one executive from Belgium. He is not translating words. He is translating people. Nathan lowered his eyes slightly, uncomfortable with the attention. Languages only matter if they help people understand one another, he said softly. Otherwise they are just sounds. Victoria found herself studying him with increasing curiosity. The calm waiter standing beside the coffee service no longer fit any explanation that made sense. His posture reflected quiet discipline. His speech carried the patience of someone accustomed to listening more than talking. Even under unexpected scrutiny, his breathing remained steady. She had interviewed thousands of executives throughout her career. Very few remained this composed when an entire room focused on them. "Mr. Brooks," she asked gently, "where did you learn all of this?" Nathan hesitated. Before he could answer, another member of the European delegation leaned forward with widened eyes. "Wait," the man said. "Nathan Brooks." Nathan looked toward him with polite surprise. "Yes, sir." The executive smiled as recognition settled across his face. 10 years ago, Geneva International Trade Summit. There was an American language consultant who resolved a negotiation that had nearly collapsed because of cultural misunderstandings. His name was Nathan Brooks. The room became perfectly still. Nathan offered a modest smile. "That was a long time ago." The executive laughed softly. "Long ago, perhaps, but none of us forgot. You saved months of negotiations by explaining one misunderstood proverb. Every delegation applauded you." Victoria blinked. Her attorneys looked at Nathan with disbelief. Marcus, still standing near the entrance, slowly lowered the serving tray he had been holding without realizing it. "You were an international consultant?" Victoria asked quietly. Nathan nodded once. "Among other things." "Then why are you working here?" someone asked before realizing how personal the question sounded. Nathan remained silent for a few moments. The warm lights reflected softly across the polished wooden table while the scent of fresh coffee drifted through the room. When he finally answered, his voice remained calm. "My wife became seriously ill several years ago. During that time, I traveled less and spent more time at home. After she passed away, my daughter needed a father more than the world needed another consultant. A job with predictable hours allowed me to be present every morning before school and every afternoon when she came home. That was the decision I never regretted." No one spoke. Even the attorneys who had dismissed him earlier lowered their eyes respectfully. Victoria felt something shift inside her. She had spent years measuring success by quarterly reports, acquisitions, and market growth. Standing before her was a man who had willingly exchanged international prestige for breakfast conversations, school lunches, and bedtime stories. There was no bitterness in his voice, no regret, only quiet gratitude for the life he had chosen. Matthias slowly smiled. "Some people become successful because of their careers," he said warmly. "Others become successful because they remember what truly matters." Nathan simply nodded. He did not seek praise. He did not defend his choices. He only reached for the coffee pot once again, prepared to continue serving the room exactly as he had before, unaware that someone else inside the room had become far more interested in the translator than in the waiter. Victoria did not return to the contract. Instead, she slowly closed the leather folder and folded her hands on the table. Her eyes moved from Nathan to the translator and then toward her chief legal officer. "Before we continue," she said calmly, "I want every translated note from tonight compared with the original discussion." No one argued. The confidence that had filled the room only minutes earlier had quietly dissolved into careful uncertainty. One attorney gathered the handwritten notes while another opened a secure laptop containing the draft agreement. Matthias Keller instructed one of his colleagues to provide direct English summaries of each major discussion point, so there would be no further misunderstanding. The comparison began. At first, the differences appeared subtle. A recommendation had become a commitment. A A suggestion had become a guarantee. Shared authority had quietly transformed into exclusive control. Every individual change seemed small enough to escape notice, but together they completely altered the foundation of the partnership. Victoria watched the growing list in silence. She had negotiated enough international agreements to recognize the pattern immediately. These were not random mistakes. They consistently favored one outcome while hiding the intentions of the other side. The translator attempted a composed smile. Complex negotiations often require interpretation choices, he explained. Certain concepts simply do not translate perfectly. Nathan remained beside the service station without speaking. He had not intervened to accuse anyone. He had only protected the truth. Victoria looked directly at the translator. Interpretation choices should clarify meaning, she replied evenly. They should never replace it. Her legal officer quietly raised another concern. There is something else. He rotated the laptop so Victoria could read the meeting log. Every revision suggested by the translator had been entered before the discussion reached those subjects. The timestamps revealed that several contract changes had already been prepared hours before the delegation even arrived. A thoughtful silence settled across the room. Matthias slowly removed his glasses. That would be difficult to explain, he observed gently. The translator reached for his phone almost instinctively before stopping himself. Nathan noticed the movement, but said nothing. Victoria noticed it as well. Would you mind leaving your phone on the table? She asked politely. The request was calm, almost gentle, yet impossible to misunderstand. After a brief hesitation, the translator complied. One member of Victoria's information security team, who had been quietly supporting the meeting from another room, entered after receiving a message from the legal department. With permission, he examined the communication history associated with the negotiation schedule and the translator's project files that had been shared through the company's secure collaboration system. Several minutes passed. Nobody rushed him. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the lights along the Chicago River shimmered across the dark water, while a sightseeing boat drifted quietly beneath one of the illuminated bridges. Inside, the only sounds came from laptop keys and the distant clink of dishes being cleared in the restaurant beyond the private room. Finally, the security specialist looked up. There are several unauthorized communications with an outside consulting firm representing one of our competitors, he said carefully. The timing overlaps with preparation for tonight's meeting. He did not speculate. He simply presented the documented timeline. Victoria closed her eyes for one brief moment before opening them again. Disappointment crossed her face more than anger. She had built her company on trust, and trust had nearly been traded away one altered sentence at a time. Matthias leaned toward Nathan with quiet gratitude. If you had remained silent, he said, both of our companies would have signed documents believing we had reached the same understanding. Months later, we would have blamed one another instead of discovering the real problem. Nathan answered with the same humility that had guided him throughout the evening. Sometimes people do not need someone louder, he said softly. They only need someone willing to tell the truth before it becomes too late. Victoria looked at him with a respect that had nothing to do with languages anymore. She realized the greatest value Nathan had brought into the room was not his remarkable knowledge. It was his character, because when remaining silent would have been easier, he had chosen honesty instead. Victoria Hale slowly rose from her chair, and every conversation inside the private dining room came to an immediate stop. The city lights beyond the tall windows shimmered across the Chicago River, but no one looked outside anymore. Every eye rested on the woman who had built one of the fastest-growing technology companies in the country. She looked first toward Matthias Keller and the members of the European delegation. On behalf of my company, she said with calm sincerity, I apologize for what nearly happened tonight. Trust is not built by contracts. It is built by honesty. Thank you for giving us the opportunity to correct this before any signatures were placed on paper. Matthias stood as well and offered a respectful nod. Good partnerships survive difficult evenings because truth eventually finds its way into the room. Victoria smiled faintly before turning toward Nathan Brooks. The waiter had quietly resumed collecting and used coffee cups as though the evening no longer concerned him. He moved with the same steady rhythm that had defined every moment since the guests arrived. Nothing about his posture suggested he expected recognition. He simply returned to doing his job. Nathan, Victoria said gently. He stopped and looked toward her. Would you please come back to the table? He hesitated for only a moment before setting the tray aside and walking forward. The executives who had dismissed him earlier instinctively shifted their chairs, making room without anyone asking. It was a small gesture, yet everyone noticed it. Respect had entered the room without announcing itself. Victoria took a slow breath. Earlier tonight, I judged you by your uniform instead of your character. That was my mistake. The room remained perfectly still. You protected my company, our partners, and everyone sitting here, even though you had nothing to gain by speaking. I owe you more than gratitude. I owe you an apology. Nathan lowered his eyes briefly. There is no need, ma'am. Victoria gently shook her head. There is every need. Leaders should admit when they are wrong, especially in front of the people who witnessed it. Several members of her board quietly nodded. Matthias smiled warmly, clearly appreciating the moment. Victoria continued. I have spent years teaching my employees that talent can come from anywhere. Tonight, I almost forgot my own lesson. Nathan answered with his familiar calm. We all miss things sometimes. What matters is what we choose to do after we notice them. Those simple words settled over the room more powerfully than any prepared speech. One of the younger attorneys quietly closed his notebook and whispered, I will remember that. Marcus, the restaurant manager, could hardly hide the pride on his face. For years he had appreciated Nathan because guests requested his service again and again. Tonight he realized that professionalism had only been the smallest part of the man standing before them. Matthias reached into his briefcase and removed the unsigned agreement. Now, he said with a smile, perhaps we should begin our negotiation again, this time with complete understanding. Soft laughter spread naturally around the table, easing the tension that had filled the evening only minutes before. The revised discussion moved forward with remarkable openness. Questions were asked directly. Answers were translated carefully, with another certified interpreter joining remotely to confirm important passages. Every clause was reviewed together. Every concern was addressed honestly. Instead of suspicion, cooperation filled the room. Hours later, when both companies finally reached an agreement that accurately reflected the intentions of everyone involved, the atmosphere felt entirely different. No one celebrated because they had won more than the other side. They celebrated because everyone had been heard. As the executives prepared to leave, Matthias paused beside Nathan once more. Tonight, he said quietly, the most valuable person in this room was not the richest one or the most powerful one. It was the man who valued truth more than comfort. Nathan offered only a modest smile. Truth belongs to everyone, he replied. Someone simply has to protect it when it becomes difficult to hear. Silence followed his words, but it was no longer the silence of uncertainty. It was the quiet respect that appears when an entire room realizes genuine character cannot be measured by a job title. 3 weeks passed, and life quietly returned to its familiar rhythm for Nathan Brooks. Every morning began the same way. He packed Lily's lunch, tucked another handwritten note beside her sandwich, and drove her to school before reporting to the hotel in his neatly pressed white shirt and black apron. The extraordinary evening that had nearly changed 2 international companies became little more than a quiet memory. Nathan never spoke about it. His coworkers occasionally asked questions, but he simply smiled and returned to polishing glasses or greeting guests with the same warmth he had always shown. Character, after all, was not something he performed when people were watching. It was something he practiced every ordinary day. One cool Friday evening, the dinner rush had just begun when Marcus approached him with an unusual expression. Nathan, he said softly, someone is asking for you in the dining room. Nathan glanced toward the entrance, expecting perhaps one of the executives from the recent negotiation. Instead, he saw Victoria Hale standing near the window, dressed not in a tailored business suit, but in a simple navy sweater and jeans. There were no assistants, no security team, no photographers. She looked less like the leader of a global company and more like someone hoping for a quiet evening away from conference rooms and board meetings. Nathan walked over with the same calm smile he offered every guest. Good evening, Ms. Hale. She returned the smile. Please, she replied. Call me Victoria. Nathan nodded politely. Good evening, Victoria. Table for one. She looked toward a nearby booth where Lily sat happily coloring another picture while sipping hot chocolate. Actually, Victoria said, if you do not mind, I was hoping for company. Nathan looked surprised. Lily noticed Victoria and waved cheerfully without hesitation. Victoria laughed softly and walked over. "You must be Lily." The little girl nodded proudly. "You are the lady Daddy helped." Nathan gave his daughter an amused look. "Lily." She smiled innocently. "What?" "It is true." Victoria laughed again, more freely this time than Nathan had ever heard. She took a seat across from them after Nathan finished serving another table. There were no business proposals waiting in her purse. No employment contracts. No offers of executive positions. They shared a simple dinner of grilled chicken, mashed potatoes, fresh vegetables, and warm rolls. Lily enthusiastically described school projects, her favorite library books, and the stray golden retriever she hoped to adopt one day. Victoria listened with genuine interest, occasionally asking questions that made Lily laugh. Watching them together, Nathan realized that the woman who had once commanded billion-dollar negotiations was completely comfortable discussing crayons, science homework, and homemade cookies. As the evening settled into comfortable conversation, Victoria looked at Nathan thoughtfully. "I have spent years believing that the best investments were companies, technologies, and markets," she admitted quietly. "Then I met a father who measured success by whether he could be home before bedtime." Nathan smiled gently. "Children do not remember stock prices. They remember who was there." Victoria lowered her eyes for a moment before looking back up. "That sentence may be the most valuable leadership lesson I have learned in years." When dinner ended, Nathan quietly placed the check on the table. Victoria reached for it, but he gently shook his head. "Tonight is on the house." She looked at him with a smile of playful disbelief. "You really should stop giving things away." Nathan laughed softly. "Kindness has a way of finding its way back." As Victoria walked toward the door, she paused and turned back one final time. "The most important thing I almost lost that night was never the contract," she said. "It was the chance to remember what real character looks like." Nathan stood beside Lily, who slipped her small hand into his. Together they watched Victoria disappear into the quiet Chicago evening. Outside, the city lights reflected across the river exactly as they had on the night everything changed. Inside, nothing appeared remarkable. A father cleared a table. A little girl finished her drawing. Another family enjoyed dessert nearby. Yet sometimes the greatest miracles never arrive with applause. They arrive as quiet respect, unexpected friendship, and the simple courage to choose truth when no one expects it. Because dignity does not need to announce itself, and real character never asks to be seen. It simply waits for the moment when someone else needs it most.